So, having a seasoned tongue that can detect the subtle differences between different kinds of adult grape juice is certainly a sign of class. In fact, the go-to Hollywood trope for showing that a character is refined is to give them a penchant for expensive wines. Even Hannibal Lecter, one of the most terrifying and cultured characters in film history, has a soft spot for Chianti. But the question at hand today is, can even the professional wine connoisseurs actually tell the difference between a Chateau Cheval Blanc 1943 and a Bodebox Chardonnay? To begin with, it's important to understand what a person has to go through to acquire the label of wine expert, otherwise known as sommelier. It turns out this varies considerably from absolutely no official required training at all — the label is technically originally a job title — to an extreme amount, as in the case of master sommeliers, of which there have been less than 300 people who have managed to achieve that certification in a little over half a century since the title started being granted. This makes it one of the most exclusive professional certifications in the world. As to the vastly more common distinction of sommelier, some who achieve this certification are simply wine enthusiasts wanting to take their hobby to the next level. Others are those working in the restaurant service industry who may have even got that title via working their way up from a simple waiter at a wine bar and learning on the job. That said, as sommelier Dustin Wilson notes, by forcing oneself to study hard for a long period of time, certification offers young sommeliers the opportunity to gain the context they need to understand wine much faster than they would if they simply relied on the dining room floor as their classroom. So this brings us to more formal certification. How rigorous a given course for certification is varies from institution to institution that offer these courses, but in general, sommeliers must be able to identify with reasonable accuracy random types of wine by taste, sight, and smell. They also have to answer various questions about winemaking, the various regions of the world that are major wine producers, and what makes wine from them different than wines that are produced elsewhere. They must also have extensive knowledge of very specific food pairings, as well as demonstrate little things like the best technique for how to open a bottle of wine and pour, which, while simple for those working in the industry, nonetheless often trips up the hobbyist attempting to get that certification. On that note, while actual formal training to get such a certification may only take dozens of hours, leading up to passing a given program's tests, a person generally needs extensive experience with all things wine, whether as a long-time hobby or experience within the industry. As you might have gathered from all of this, all sommeliers are not created equal. Some may be immensely knowledgeable and skilled at judging various wines, while others might be a little better than your wine enthusiast cousin called Jill. This all brings us to the elite of the elite, master sommeliers. These are the Yodas of the wine world, and it's no coincidence that the average salary for one eclipses that of mere mortal sommeliers. For your reference, a run-of-the-mill, lowly, just starting out sommelier might make as little as in the $40,000 a year range, whereas someone who has passed the tests to become an advanced sommelier earns around $78,000 a year on average. The master sommeliers, on the other hand, typically make about $150,000 per year and can usually be found working at some of the world's finest restaurants. The testing to become a master sommelier is vastly more rigorous, and those invited to test, and yes, it's invite only, must have first passed the introductory exam, then the certified exam, and then the advanced sommelier's exam. Those who pursue this course also tend to have previously had extensive backgrounds in the culinary arts and typically have many years of experience working as a sommelier in some wine-serving establishments. Once they've distinguished themselves enough in the field, they may then be invited to take the tests to become a master sommelier. From here, they are given 3 years to pass 3 tests, including a practical restaurant service section, a verbal examination covering all things wine related to incredible depth, from history to grape cultivation in various regions to various winemaking methods, and finally the most difficult test of all is the taste test. In this, they are given 6 random wines chosen from the thousands produced in the world. In 25 minutes, they must correctly identify not just what region of the world each one comes from, but also the exact year the grapes were harvested. Each candidate is allowed to take each test up to 6 times in the 3-year span, but even then, as you might expect from so few ever having achieved this certification, many fail despite already being considered advanced wine experts before even attempting the tests. Now, given all of this, surely the elite wine professionals must be able to tell the difference between random expensive and random cheap wines, right? Well, yes, the elite of the elite absolutely can, but Well, no, they can't at all, actually. So what do I mean and what's going on here? Well, there are several factors that go into this. First, there's the business side, with a variety of factors that go into what makes something an expensive or a cheap wine. This goes far beyond just taste. Making such distinctions smaller than ever, winemaking has become a huge business on a scale and with scientific rigor that has never been seen in the industry before. This is all in an effort to create the best wines for as cheaply as possible. As journalist and sommelier Bianca Bosca notes, one of the things that I did was go into this wine conglomerate, Treasury Wine Estates, that produces millions of bottles of wine per year. People are there developing wine the way flavor scientists develop the new Oreos or Doritos flavor. Noteworthy here is that the scientists extensively use sommeliers to help tweak their mass-produced wines to be as high quality as possible, even for the experts. They further add a variety of things to the wine, not unlike adding ingredients to any beverage, to tweak just about every facet of it until they come up with an end product that they think will maximally appeal to consumers. As a result, even disregarding business elements affecting price beyond taste, the gap between inexpensive wines and the finest has closed considerably in recent decades. Further, there are more varieties of wine today to enjoy than there ever have been before. All of this makes it an effort in futility for even a master sommelier to be able to consistently identify one wine as one that was probably ultra expensive versus more of a middle-of-the-road variety of the same type of wine. Partially as a result of this, studies have shown that while the public can identify the difference between the cheapest of wines at a couple of dollars a bottle and, say, a $20 or $30 bottle, as soon as you start to go much above that, we mere mortals tend to differentiate the two with about the same accuracy as you'd expect in predicting the results of a coin flip. That said, it turns out there is actually a slight and very interesting correlation. In one study with over 6,000 tasters, comprising about 12% sommeliers and the rest the general public, trying to determine if people like expensive wines more than cheap ones, it turns out that we find the correlation between price and overall rating is small and negative, suggesting that individuals, on average, enjoy more expensive wines slightly less. For individuals with wine training, however, we find indications of a positive relationship between price and enjoyment. Our results indicate that both the prices of wine and wine recommendations by experts may be poor guides for non-expert wine consumers. Thus, similar to music or really any field, those who are experts do seem to enjoy the finer, more complex versions. On the other side, there is the general public who seem to prefer listening to whatever the latest is from Taylor Swift. Or as one music professor, the co-author of this piece, once had, was fond of saying with respect to pop music versus things like a symphony, cotton candy tastes great, but you can only eat so much of it before you start to get sick of it and start craving a high-quality steak dinner. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, sure, it's easy to be fooled by the business side of things when talking price, but what about all those studies that show wine experts can't even tell white wine from red in blind taste tests? Well, it turns out there's a lot more going on with it than the clickbait headlines tend to indicate. This should be fairly obvious from the fact that master sommeliers are able to pass the test that they do in the first place, which would be impossible if their skills were really as bad as people say they are. As fellow YouTuber Wheezy Waiter points out in his aptly titled song, "A headline's not an article, a headline is not an article." You see, as ever, our monkey brains are gonna monkey brain. We humans are just really, really easy to trick, especially when it comes to our senses. Ever eaten something minty and then drank a room temperature glass of water? Congratulations, you've just tricked your body into thinking you were drinking ice cold water because methanol binds with cold sensitive receptors that make these much more sensitive than normal, so they trigger more easily and you feel a cold sensation even though everything is the same temperature as before. So everything from what you ate or drank before to sense in the environment you're currently in to even your level of fatigue can influence the way you perceive the taste of something. On top of physical things like that, there's your expectations, which can be absurdly easily influenced, especially when it comes to taste. So now let's talk about wine. Contained within the grape juice are many dozens of esters and aldehydes, sugars, minerals, organic acids, etc., etc. This cocktail all derives from the grapes, processes of the yeast as it works its magic, and what the wine is processed and stored in during its journey from plant to your belly. This all creates the colors, smells, and tastes which combine to form the flavor you perceive when you ingest the wine. To give you an idea of the scope of things here, consider that over 400 compounds that influence the scent alone have been identified in wine. On that note, temperature by itself can make a huge difference to taste, among other reasons because of how this can affect the boiling point and thus smell, and in turn taste, of some of these compounds in the wine. As wine enthusiast David Derbyshire notes, serve a New World Chardonnay too cold and you only taste the overpowering oak. Serve a red too warm and the heady boozy qualities will be overpowering. As for the wine experts, while they may have honed their skills with sometimes thousands of hours of study into all things wine, they still have the same monkey brain as the rest of us. Case in point, we have wine expert and journalist Katie Kelly Bell, who was traveling with a fellow group of wine connoisseurs. While at Waters Vineyard in Washington state, the owner poured everyone 2 glasses of white wine and asked them to identify which type they were. Bell sums up, "We swirled, we sniffed, we wrinkled our brows in contemplation, some of us nodding with assurance. I took notes, finding the first white to be more floral and elegant than the second. Drawing on my years and years, there have been too many, of tasting, studying, and observation, I swiftly concluded that the first was an unoaked Chardonnay and the second was a Sauvignon Blanc. Easy peasy. Much to my mortification, I was dead wrong, as was everyone else in the room. The proprietor chuckled and informed his room that the wines were actually the same wine. One was just warmer than the other. He wasn't intentionally shaming us. Not one person got it right. He was pointedly demonstrating the power of just one element in the wine tasting experience: temperature." Now consider a test conducted at the suggestion of winery owner Robert Hodgson at the California State Fair Wine Competition. Essentially, the panels of 65 to 70 expert judges were given a huge variety of wines to rank as per usual. But what they were not told is that they were actually given each of the wines 3 times from the exact same bottle. After running this same experiment 4 consecutive years, what Hodgson found was that, to quote the paper published on the experiment, only about 10% of the judges were able to replicate their score within a single medal group. In fact, he even found 10% of the judges were so far off that they switched a bronze rating to a gold for the exact same wine from the exact same bottle. In another study conducted by Hodgson, an analysis of the concordance among 13 US wine competitions, it was found that in the vast majority of cases, receiving a gold medal at one wine competition had virtually no correlation to not just being ranked similarly at another competition, but in many cases that same wine scoring below average at other competitions. As to what's going on here, Hodgson sums up, "There are individual expert tasters with exceptional abilities sitting alone who have a good sense, but when you sit 100 wines in front of them, the task is beyond human ability." In yet another test, the one by Frenchman Frédéric Brochet in 2001, he found that simply changing the label of the same bottle of wine from an expensive, well-thought-of type to a cheap one resulted in the 57 taste testers almost universally changing their tune on not just how they liked it, but even various attributes about it. In another experiment, Brochet also gave a similar panel a glass of white wine and a glass of red wine and gave them a list of common words used to describe white and red wines and told them to assign them appropriately to the 2 wines in front of them. It turns out the red wine was actually the same as the white wine except dyed red. And only a small percentage of the tasters were able to accurately identify that both wines tasted the same in the descriptive words they chose to identify each wine with. And yes, contrary to what is almost universally stated, not all of the wine taste testers got it wrong. Nevertheless, most did. While you may try to argue that perhaps the results ended up being different because the dye had an effect on the flavor, beyond that it was purported to be flavorless dye, and we can be reasonably sure it didn't drastically alter the taste to jammy, spicy, and intense, among other common terms that wine professionals use to talk about red wines. That said, important to note here is that while Brochet's studies are often cited as definitively showing how bad wine experts are at judging wines, in this case that they can't even tell the difference between red and white wines, that's not what the study actually showed at all. Blindfold even amateur wine drinkers and legitimately give them a white and a red wine, and they are likely going to do extremely well at telling the difference, as anyone who's ever drunk wine could pretty much attest to. Rather, this test simply showed how easily our perception of things is influenced by suggestion. Just as importantly here, what literally every single source we could find not only leaves out when reporting this story, but in the vast majority of cases falsely states, is the actual qualifications of those being tested by Brochet. It turns out the people he was using as taste testers were not experts at all, simply undergraduate students studying enology, that's wine and winemaking. While certainly probably obviously more knowledgeable than your average person on the street, nobody would call an undergraduate mathematics major just learning the ropes a maths expert, nor would their skills be indicative of what their professors who have vastly more experience and are actual experts are capable of doing. Thus, how expert any of these students were at the point in their education when given these tests isn't clear. What would be far more interesting and indicative is to give that same exact test to the world's master sommeliers and see how they did. Presumably because they still have monkey brains like the rest of us, they would still perform poorly, but nobody yet has run that test that we could find. However they would do it in such a scenario, what is undeniable is that study after study shows that our perception and expectation vastly influences our experiences, not just in wine tasting, but in pretty much every facet of life. As the master sommeliers demonstrate by passing the taste test they are subjected to in the first place, with enough time and study, there are actually people who are exceptionally good at identifying and judging attributes of wines in the right circumstances. But overwhelm their senses with 100 wines or change their expectations about what they are tasting, and their perceptions will change significantly, seemingly making them little better than a random person off the street at telling anything definitive about the wine. And then, when adding not just telling attributes about the wine, but also whether it is inexpensive to purchase or expensive, the whole thing is a bit of an effort in futility. In the end, a handcrafted table might cost a lot more than one that is mass-produced, but if they are made from more or less the same materials and the company mass-producing them hasn't chosen to cut any corners, the mass-produced and often vastly cheaper table will, in a lot of cases, actually be objectively better and certainly more consistently so, thanks to machined and automated precision. But that does not stop people from appreciating and enjoying their handcrafted table more than the same basic table purchased from IKEA. As with everything, you like what you like. Wine tasting is subjective, and what about a given type appeals to you is really all that matters. If knowing you paid $200 for that glass enhances your experience, fantastic. For others, buying bottles of $2 chuck so they can enjoy many glasses with a large group of friends at a party is going to be a more enjoyable experience. For others, attending wine events where various fancy wines are sampled and discussed more than makes them worth the extra cost and the trip. For yet others, sipping alone at home, the cheap wine that has had sugars added to it to make it a little sweeter might be their preferred cup of tea. As the old adage goes, the only thing that matters with regard to a wine is whether or not you like it. Whatever your preferences, just don't be a snob about it, whether a wine connoisseur or not. I think we can all agree that wine snobs are right up there with grammar Nazis.
An early example of beneficial government regulation to proof alcohol was simply to test and verify that the contents of a barrel of liquid was what it claimed to be. The process began in England around the 16th century. Its original purpose was not consumer protection, but rather to ensure that the state, read the king, collected the proper amount of taxes on the sale of the product. Alcohol, called proof spirits, was taxed at a higher rate. The first method was imprecise at best and involved soaking a gun pellet in the liquid and then trying to light it on fire. If it burned, it was classified as a proof spirit. However, as alcohol's flammability is dependent on its temperature, the higher the temperature, the more vapors the alcohol-infused solution will emit, and therefore the more flammable, sometimes actual alcohol was passed off as something less and taxed at a lower rate. Nonetheless, frequently the product would catch fire, and by that the authorities would know that the spirit, usually rum, was at least 57.15% alcohol by volume, ABV, which at that time was classified as being 100 proof. As scientific skills improved, by the early 19th century, a far more accurate test was developed which measured the liquid's specific gravity, the ratio of the density of a substance to a reference, in this case distilled water. Distilled water is actually denser than alcohol. Accordingly, in 1816, a test was developed that relied on the fact that at 11 degrees Celsius, that's 51 degrees Fahrenheit, a 100 proof spirit, about 57.15% ABV, would weigh 12/13 that of distilled water. As 57.15% is roughly equivalent to 4 in 7, in the UK, in order to convert a lower alcohol to proof, you simply multiply the ABV by 7/4 or 1.75. So, if you had a delicious IPA with an ABV of 16.9%, in the UK this would be 12.075 degrees of proof, while a 100% ABV pure alcohol would have a proof of 175 degrees. In the US, this somewhat complicated method was rejected. In an early example of too long didn't read, and instead proof is calculated simply by doubling the ABV. So in the States, that IPA would be 13.8 proof, while Jack Daniel's with an ABV of 40% is 80 proof. Of course, some spirits far exceeded these ABVs, with a number of neutral grain and rectified spirits reaching ABVs of 96%, 168 degrees of proof in the UK and 192 degrees of proof in the US. In the United States, these alcohols are regulated, if at all, by the particular states. For example, Nevada prohibits the sale of alcohol in excess of 80% ABV, and California prohibits the sale of anything over 60% ABV. Uncle Sam has singled out one alcohol in particular for regulation, however, absinthe. Sometimes called the Green Fairy, this exotic spirit with an ABV of 45 to 75%, infused with green anise, fennel, and other herbs, and most notably grand woodworm, fueled Paris's Belle Epoque, and is credited by some as inspiring a variety of artistic movements, such as Surrealism, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Modernism, and Cubism, as well as the writings of notables including Oscar Wilde and Ernest Hemingway. In the early 1900s, a number of countries banned absinthe. 1912 in the US, due in equal measure to a smear campaign conducted by the wine industry, lurid tales of men under its spell committing horrid violent crimes, and the presumed presence of thujone, a chemical compound that is said to be poisonous in large amounts. As it turns out, though, absinthe actually has very small amounts of thujone and easily meets all regulatory requirements in the US, which is no more than 10 parts per million. As such, as of about 2007, absinthe returned to the US, both as imports from Europe along with domestic producers springing up as well.
There are seemingly never-ending news stories involving the mugshot of a drunk driver mostly unharmed after getting into an accident. Meanwhile, their victims are left fighting for their lives, or worse, they're already dead. The perception from this is that somehow being drunk will protect you from sustaining injuries in the event of a car crash or some other trauma. As to why, the commonly held idea is that the more relaxed you are in your drunken stupor, the less likely you are to get injured. As to why, the general idea often put forth is that you'll bend and contort into whatever shape the accident puts you in without fighting it. Stiffening up prevents your ability to fold like a pretzel and makes all of your inner bits tense. Thus, you snap like a twig, injuring yourself more readily and severely. But, well, is any of this actually true? Are drunk drivers actually less likely to be injured than their vastly more responsible compatriots? It turns out there are indeed many studies on the topic that show you have a greater chance of survival from trauma should alcohol be in your system. That said, other studies show overall mortality can be as much as twofold higher if you have alcohol on board. So, which is correct? And is the whole floppy drunk thing actually protecting you? To begin with, let us look at the whole flopsy the drunk thing. All the nerve cells in your central nervous system can be either excited or inhibited by neurotransmitters. The more excited, the quicker and stronger your muscles will react. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Thus, it gives your brain and spinal cord the ability to send electrical signals at high rates of speed. Alcohol inhibits glutamate's ability to do this by reducing ion flow through glutamate receptors. It can do this with blood alcohol levels as low as 0.03. The more alcohol you consume, the harder it is for you to control those muscles because glutamate can no longer be transmitted as readily. The result of all of this, well, it makes you walk like Gumby in an earthquake. So now let's look at flopsy in a car wreck. When you get into such an accident, there are actually 3 collisions. The car hitting something, you hitting the inside of the car, and your organs hitting the inside of your body. So, as the floppy drunk hypothesis goes, if you're sober as a Catholic priest on Sunday, you'll tense up, reducing the absorption capacity of your body to take the punch and making your rubber band-like tendons and the like tighter and more likely to snap as a result. Compare that to your inebriated counterpart who takes the path of least resistance, turning their arms and legs into a newly acquired airbag and fully taking advantage of your stretchy inner bits doing their thing. On the surface, well, this all seems reasonable enough. Unfortunately, due to the decrease in your muscles' tension, the argument can be made the impact of your body with the car will be a greater force than if your arms or legs were tensed and able to direct that force in a more controlled way. On that note, in the journal article, Does Alcohol Intoxication Protect Patients from Severe Injury and Reduce Hospital Mortality, published in the American Surgeon in December of 2013, researchers found those with positive blood alcohol levels actually had an increased risk of sustaining head, facial, chest, and abdominal injuries. Those injuries are obviously much more prone to killing you than the arm or leg fractures, torn tendons, and the like sustained from stiffened limbs. From this and other such studies, while the research to date is unfortunately far from definitive, the idea that you're more likely to survive a car accident because you become as floppy as your grandpa before Viagra is generally considered somewhat suspect, or at the least currently falling solidly under the category of more research needed. That said, there really is a growing body of evidence showing that a large amount of alcohol in your system will give you a better chance of survival in a traumatic event. Though we should also point out that it also drastically increases your chances of getting in that traumatic event in the first place. Hold my beer is a meme for a reason. Further indicating that being flopsy isn't the root cause is that it turns out that the benefit here does require you to make it through your alcohol-fueled traumatic event and reach medical aid. Whether drunk or not, unsurprisingly, should you remain alive long enough to see the hospital, chances are you'll survive the initial assault on your system. For everyone, the complications after, from how the body reacts to your injury, will now be your greatest enemy to whether you survive beyond. And it is this that is thought to be where the real benefit comes from, how alcohol affects these bodily reactions. On that note, in January of 2010, researchers publishing in the Journal of American Medical Association Motor Vehicle Crashes, the association of alcohol consumption with the type and severity of injuries and outcomes, found that those whose injuries were the most severe had a significantly better survival rate compared to those who didn't if they had high levels of alcohol in their system. On top of that, even though drunk people were more likely to get severe head trauma and septic complications, infections, they nevertheless had better survival rates despite this. Backing up this idea, in 2012 at the University of Illinois at Chicago, researcher and injury epidemiologist Lee Friedman found alcohol decreased mortality for all types of traumatic injuries: fractures, open wounds, and internal injuries, just to name a few. The only type of trauma not seeing a benefit was burn patients. This makes sense given the immunosuppressant effects of alcohol and the known deadly complication of infection in burn patients. Dr. Friedman also showed that the benefits increased the higher the blood alcohol concentration was, reducing mortality up to 50% in some cases. Unfortunately, as he points out, no one definitively knows why this is the case. There just aren't currently many studies looking at the physiologic mechanisms involved in alcohol's protective effects once the body is injured. In his 2014 study, Complications Associated with Blood Alcohol Concentration Following Injury, he hypothesized the protective benefits came from how alcohol affects the many types of complications following injury, specifically reducing the chances of having said complications in the first place. Looking at the data of those who were covered in the study who died, 43.2% had at least one complication. However, among the inebriated, instances of complications were indeed decreased. For example, the tipsy individual saw a decrease in cardiac complications by 23.5% and renal function complications by 30%. Friedman states, "The current analysis shows there were reductions in medical complications dominating the cardiovascular system and kidneys, which provides clues to solving this interesting and potentially life-saving puzzle." Throwing a wrench into things, however, is a 2011 study, Alcohol Exposure and Outcomes in Trauma Patients. Published in the European Journal of Trauma and Emergency Surgery, these researchers found mortality was almost twofold higher in trauma patients who had alcohol in their system. Further, victims of penetrating trauma were more likely to be admitted with no vital signs if they had alcohol in their system compared to those who didn't. They also found that those who were alcohol positive were more likely to be admitted with low blood pressure, hypotension, and a lower GCS, a measure of mentation known as the Glasgow Coma Scale. They surmised that this may increase mortality. As to why, they point out alcohol alters hemodynamic, metabolic, and inflammatory homeostasis after hemorrhage, blunts the catecholamine surge after injury, and reduces the electrical threshold for ventricular arrhythmias. Immunosuppressive effects from alcohol increase the risk of secondary infections. In English, basically you'll bleed more if you get cut when tipsy because the body's ability to constrict blood vessels and clot off is reduced. The chance of your heart going into deadly rhythms is increased. Should you get an infection, your body's ability to fight it will be diminished. The authors do point out, however, that there's a discordance in the studies resulting in inconsistent findings in the literature. They also state that their study greatly contributes to the continued controversy over the issue and will, of course, mandate further study to reach any level of definitiveness. Very important to point out here is that when looking at these various studies, part of the controversy and seemingly inconsistent data is that wildly different results often depend on what type of trauma the researchers are studying. Burns versus gunshots versus motor vehicle accidents, etc. This, of course, shouldn't come as a big surprise, as there's no such thing as a cure-all, and thus it's not surprising alcohol might be beneficial in some types of injuries, while not in others. It's just the question of whether you'll be safer in, say, a car accident or not if drunk isn't yet fully clear when all factors are considered, including deaths directly after the initial impact. That said, while not for every traumatic situation, there is convincing evidence mortality in certain types of patients can be reduced with the addition of some good old-fashioned moonshine. Take traumatic brain injuries, TBI for example. There are quite a few studies and reviews showing alcohol will have a protective effect should you have one. When you get a TBI, your body's fight-or-flight nervous system, sympathetic, releases a surge of neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and epinephrine. It also ends up with high levels of excitatory neurotransmitters like glutamate and aspartate. The release of these causes a cascade of chemistry leading to neuron cell death. Calcium influx also causes mitochondrial death. Mitochondria produces adenosine triphosphate, which is needed to give cells their ability to function. Sodium influx is also increased, causing the cell to swell and die. To prevent this, if you just blocked the receptor sites, allowing these chemicals to weave their web of woe, you can help in the complications from them, and your neurons will live to fight another day. One pathway is to block a receptor known as N-methyl-D-aspartate, NMDA. Remember how blocking glutamate makes you all floppy when you're drunk? NMDA is a type of glutamate receptor. Block it, and you're floppy, and you get to save some brain cells from a TBI. Alcohol is also associated with marked decreases in epinephrine and norepinephrine release, so alcohol will decrease the surge of sympathetic neurotransmitters while not allowing the ones that are there, like glutamate, to work, giving you a greater chance of saving those precious brain cells should you have a TBI. For what it's worth, animal studies on rats in 2013 also seemed to confirm this data, showing that neuron cell death was decreased after a TBI if alcohol was present in the rat's bloodstream. Thus, while your chances of getting a TBI are greatly increased when you're drunk, funnily enough, you'll have a better chance of survival when you actually get one. In the end, while we can't say for sure if alcohol will protect you from injury or death in an accident, contrary to popular belief, while much more data is definitely needed to be definitive about it, it does not appear that being floppy is the reason for the protection. There is, however, a growing body of evidence it will help in certain types of injuries that may occur in such an accident, potentially paving the way for a new and effective way to help treat certain traumatic injuries once things are a bit more definitive. Of course, though, the more you drink, the more likely you are to be injured in the first place, so let's just not drink and drive, okay? To many people, adding one of the principal ingredients in antifreeze to wine sounds almost cartoonishly stupid and evil, which is probably why that exact scenario is the basis for an entire episode of The Simpsons. Nevertheless, for at least 7 years, many major winemakers in Austria decided to add this highly toxic poison to their wines, with a handful of bottles even found to contain enough of the offending substance that one person imbibing said bottle would shortly thereafter no longer be capable of drinking, well, anything ever again. So whose monumentally stupid idea was this, and why did they do it? While you might think surely this could only have occurred in the Wild West days of newly industrialized food sales in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time, for example, that saw US researcher Dr. Harvey Wiley famously put together his poison squad to ingest variously highly questionable common food additives. In fact, this particular wine event took place in the late 20th century. Our story begins in the early 1970s, when Austrian winemakers had made something of a splash in the wine world by flooding the market with bottles of plonk that were paradoxically cheap but consistently rated as reasonably good quality. In particular, Austrian winemakers were known for producing inexpensive yet exceptional sweet white wines, which quickly became popular throughout Germany and were exported to a variety of other countries en masse, including the United States. As a result of all this, a number of German stores placed large orders with major Austrian winemakers, and important here is that many of these deals specifically required Austrian winemakers to follow the Prädikat scale and produce wines that, if produced in Germany, would rank very highly on it. Most pertinently, this means they had to be fairly sweet tasting. Trouble began almost immediately for the winemakers, however, when a change in weather patterns in the late 1970s and continuing into the 1980s resulted in many vineyards growing too many grapes. While you'd think an abundance of grapes would be a good thing, the specific kind of wine German supermarkets had ordered necessitated the growing of a smaller number of grapes that would then be left to ripen on the vine. Significantly higher grape yields made proper ripening a no-go in some cases, and as a result, many Austrian winemakers ended up with thousands of gallons of wine that was, to quote one contemporary report, thin and sour. In other words, large contracts were signed, but a lot of the winemakers could no longer meet the terms of the deal in quality and quantity of wine to be delivered. Thus, the winemakers began desperately to experiment with ways to make the wine taste better, doing things like adding sugar and fruit to hit the needed ratings. We should also note here that doing this was a huge no-no and would definitely constitute breaching the contract if it was discovered, but at least, if not found out, they could deliver the product and get paid. As for who first suggested adding a highly toxic chemical to the wine to sweeten it, and when, according to a later investigation, the finger seems to be pointed at wine consultant and chemist Otto Nadrasky Sr. He allegedly suggested to the winemakers who had hired him that adding a small amount of diethyl glycol to the wine not only made it taste sweeter, but also added a significant amount of body, making it taste like a much higher quality wine than it actually was. As another bonus, the chemical was also relatively cheap. As for when this happened, the first known bottles that would later test positive for the chemical seem to have been from around 1978 or so, give or take. Of course, the one drawback of all of this is that diethylene glycol is extremely toxic. In fact, it was this very chemical added to some medicine to make it more appealing to children in the early 20th century that spurred a complete overhaul of the power of the formerly toothless FDA in the United States. More on this insane tragedy in a bonus fact in a bit. Going back to the Austrian wine incident, after conducting a few tests to ensure that adding the chemical could fool the palates of even the most seasoned wine experts, the first wines with the chemical added were shipped. Not long after, it seems the news quietly spread out around the Austrian wine industry of how they could boost the perceived quality of their wines cheaply and easily. That said, it should be noted here that there were, at the time, over 2,000 wine brands in Austria, and it would appear that only a few hundred of them ultimately did this, with the majority of altered wines connected to some of the biggest brands and bottlers. Amazingly, the fact that many Austrian winemakers were selling wine sweetened with actual poison went unnoticed for several years. The key was that most bottles, with some alarming exceptions we'll get to shortly, needed only a fraction of a gram to a few grams of diethylene glycol per litre to get the flavour right. For reference, while there is no firm number universally accepted, it's generally considered that a fatal dose of the substance would be around 15 to 70 grams consumed at once, depending on a variety of factors. The result was that for someone to die relatively quickly from the poison, they'd need to drink a dozen or two bottles in relatively short order to make that happen. Thus, while unequivocally regularly ingesting small amounts of diethylene glycol can result in liver and kidney damage along with eventual neurological issues, among other problems, it wasn't going to be something that people would necessarily link to wine consumption, and certainly it would take time for issues to pop up. Because of this, the scheme was not revealed by anyone dying. Rather, on June 27, 1985, at least 7 years after the winemakers began doing this, a laboratory in West Germany was running routine tests on bottles of wine bought in a local supermarket to ensure that they didn't contain artificial sweeteners. This testing had become more and more common thanks to an earlier scandal involving Italian winemakers who started adding sweeteners to their wines from 1980 to 1982. What the lab found in this case was a 1983 bottle of Ruster or Solis, bought from a supermarket in Stuttgart, had been contaminated with the offending chemical somehow. Authorities were understandably concerned to learn the poison had found its way into the wine and quickly ordered additional tests on more bottles of wine from the region, fearing that they had somehow been contaminated during production. However, as more and more bottles from a diverse group of suppliers were found to contain the chemical, it became apparent that something altogether more nefarious was afoot. The scandal only grew from there. You see, Austrian Agriculture Minister Gunther Haydn openly admitted his group found out 3 months before the aforementioned lab discovered that the chemical was being put in certain wines. Upon this discovery, other bodies within the Austrian government were alerted to the problem, including the courts for potential prosecution of the winemakers. In fine bureaucratic form, however, absolutely nobody did anything about it. From there, they didn't even tell the public. A little over a month after this, the Austrian minister also stated they informed the West German authorities of the tainted Austrian wine, first telling them on May the 10th. This was about a month and a half before the lab made their discovery and broke the news. As you might have guessed from this, much like their Austrian counterparts, the West German authorities did nothing when they first learned of the problem from the Austrians. Although, in this case, rather than admit they'd known, as the Austrians did, the German officials initially denied that they'd been told anything. Soon enough, however, mounting evidence that they were lying through their full-bodied diethylene glycol-sweetened teeth came out, and they fessed up. Naturally, the public were outraged, and the West German government, seemingly overcompensating for their previous lack of action, quickly banned the sale of all wines from Austria in the country, even though only about 15% of the winemakers had taken part. The government further confiscated every bottle of Austrian wine available for sale in Germany to the tune of about 27 million litres of the product. However, due to the toxic nature of diethylene glycol, West German authorities initially found it difficult to dispose of the wine safely until a representative from a concrete plant suggested they used it as a cooling agent instead of water in certain industrial applications, and this apparently worked. In any event, as far away as the United States, bottles of Austrian wine were likewise found to have the chemical added. However, in the United States, rather than ban the Austrian wine outright, the government somewhat more sensibly allowed wine sellers who purchased the wine to sell it so long as they first proved that a given brand for a given year had not tainted their wine. While this might seem risky, of the 1,500 or so Austrian wine brands imported into the US at the time, after extensive testing, it was found that only about 0.02% of these seem to have actually taken part in the poisoning. Again, one of the reasons Germany saw such massively higher numbers seems to have primarily been the brands in question attempting to fulfill their contracts with the German outlets and needing sweeter wine than they could otherwise naturally produce, given the weather at the time. Whatever the case, adding to the outrage was the discovery that one brand of non-alcoholic grape juice targeted at kids was also found to have taken part in the scheme, with 1 gram of their bottles having as high as 1 gram per litre of diethylene glycol. As some kids drank a lot of juice regularly, and the fatal or damaging dose for a child is markedly smaller than an adult, naturally the public didn't take kindly to this news. Adding even more fuel to the fire, while most of the wine in question wasn't fatally dangerous in a single bottle, some bottles were. For example, a bottle of 1981 Welch Riesling Bernauseles was found to contain a whopping 48 grams of diethylene glycol, enough to kill most humans were said human to drink a whole bottle in a day. Add up all these facts, and you're probably now thinking that the death toll must have been catastrophic. Well, it turns out, officially, not only did no one die as a result of this mass poisoning, but apparently nobody even suffered health issues from it, at least as far as any official records we could find are concerned. That said, given the known bottles that had lethal amounts of the chemical in one bottle alone and the long-term negative effects of regular ingestion of small quantities of diethylene glycol, unsurprisingly, many are still skeptical nobody died or suffered health complications, as is the official line. It seems much more probable that these issues that likely occurred were simply never connected to the wine. Whatever the case, as you might expect, the reputation of Austrian wine was severely tarnished. This saw exports on their wine drop from about 159 million litres in 1984 to just 3.7 million litres in 1985. There was also a marked drop in wine tourism to the country in the aftermath. To fix the issue, the Austrian government ushered in sweeping legislation related to all things wine, ultimately instituting some of the strictest regulations for winemaking anywhere in the world. They then highly publicized this internationally in an attempt to reassure people of the quality of Austrian wine going forward, but it didn't work. It would take until 2001, a full 16 years after news of the scandal broke, for Austrian export numbers to match their pre-scandal levels. That said, not unlike how Coke switching to New Coke resulted in massive publicity for the company, but later directly resulted in re-establishing Coca-Cola Classic's dominance in the market, wine experts have since concluded that this wine scandal was arguably a huge long-term boon for the Austrian wine industry. This is thanks to the intensely strict regulations Austrian winemakers are now subjected to, which in turn has resulted in an almost unparalleled reputation for quality in Austrian wine in recent years. And now for some bonus facts. The aforementioned elixir soldanilamide incident, which saw sweeping changes to the power that the FDA had to regulate things, began thanks to a chemist for S.E. Massengill Co., a rather large company that's still around today. The chemist in question, one Harold Cole Watkins, realized he could make a popular and very effective medicine taste better if he added diethylene glycol to it. This helped the medicine become more appealing to children. The only downside was taking the medicine with the diethylene glycol added would result in an almost certainly slow and excruciating death for these children as a result, with nothing the parents could do after initial ingestion but watch their children literally writhe and scream in agony for many days until they died thanks to the medicine that their parents had fed them. As one Mary Nedifer wrote to President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the time, "The first time I ever had occasion to call in a doctor for Joan, she was given elixir of sulfanilamide. All that is left to us is the caring for her little grave. Even the memory of her is mixed with sorrow, for we can see her little body tossing to and fro and hear that little voice screaming with pain, and it seems as though it would drive me insane." Nevertheless, the company went ahead with the addition of the chemical anyway, with results being even worse than you'd expect, given that as the death toll mounted, rather than tell pharmacists of the issue and immediately get the products off the shelves, they merely politely requested a non-urgent recall of the medicine. You can find much more about this in our video, Why Are Kinder Surprise Eggs Illegal in the United States? And please do note here, contrary to literally thousands of emails and comments we've gotten about it, yes, Kinder Surprise eggs are still illegal in the United States. Those Kinder Joys you see on the shelves are a completely different product. Please stop emailing me about this. On a much lighter note, soon after the Austrian wine scandal broke, several sellers tried to cover their tracks by simply disposing of their product in any way that they could to get rid of the evidence, something that ironically made some of them easier to catch. For example, a guy called Anton Schmid tried getting rid of 4,000 gallons of his spiked wine by dumping it into a sewer. He was later caught when people noticed that all of the trout in a nearby river had died. The authorities tested the water, put two and two together, and relatively easily traced it back to Schmid, who was quickly arrested. If you might have been doubting Schmid's intelligence at this point, it turns out authorities didn't end up needing to test all of the wines to figure out some of the culprits, as some winemakers had been stupid enough to list their purchasing of large amounts of diethylene glycol on their tax returns.
Perhaps no image is more synonymous with the act of winemaking than a person smashing grapes with their bare feet in order to extract the precious juices contained therein. In the grapes, not in their sweaty feet. But did winemakers ever really do this? To answer this question, that largely depends on who you ask. Today, certain winemakers, usually ones that have some sort of financial interest in it, at least publicly maintain that grape stomping was an integral part of winemaking history. However, historians tend to think that it was a relatively rare practice. To be clear, nobody is saying that ancient people didn't crush grapes with their feet to extract the juices. Rather, it is known that man has had a much more efficient alternative to this method for at least 6,000 years. We know this because in early 2011, archaeologists uncovered the remnants of an archaic winery, complete with a wine press dating back to 4000 BC. This was located in Armenia. Wine itself can be traced back to at least 5400 BC, which would suggest that early man must have had a more rudimentary method of crushing grapes before somebody invented a wine press, and indeed, probably it did involve the use of feet. This is supported by the existence of numerous pieces of artwork and other references from history illustrating people curb-stomping piles of grapes while they stood in giant vats. Perhaps the most prominent pieces come from ancient Egypt, where it's largely believed that stomping grapes was a common part of winemaking, as evidenced by numerous pieces of artwork depicting exactly that. However, it's important to note that this was by no means the only step in the juice extraction process. You see, treading grapes is a remarkably inefficient method of extracting juice from them. And up until really recently in history, humans were really against wasting food. After stomping grapes, the ancient Egyptians would then put the leftovers into a large sack, at which point poles were tied to the sack's four corners, and by turning them, the rest of the grape juice was squeezed out. A thing to keep in mind is that pressing grapes is a deceptively difficult task, and the amount of pressure you use to squeeze grapes must be closely monitored to avoid accidentally releasing bitter tannins from the seeds, which can obviously negatively affect the taste of the final product. With this in mind, pressing grapes by using simple body weight seems like a good way to avoid having to apply too much pressure. However, it's just too inefficient to be used on a mass scale unless you are earning Egyptian pharaoh levels of money and had a fleet of slaves or workers to do it for you. Not surprisingly, in almost every civilization in which wine presses were used, there appears to be little evidence that they also stomped wine. They simply didn't need to, as they had a much more efficient way of doing it. An exception to this can actually be found in ancient Rome, where grape stomping was a common practice in order to extract the initial juices from the grapes, which they believed to have special properties that the rest of the juice did not. Even in this case, the Romans are still noted to have used presses to extract the bulk of the juices after this initial stomping. As for why treading grapes seems to be so synonymous with winemaking in general, despite being inefficient, unsanitary, rarely used in history, and time-consuming, that may have to do a lot with the winemaking industry itself playing it up into romanticize the old imagery of winemaking. If there's one thing the wine industry is great at, it's making wine seem grandiose when, in the end, it's just fruit juice. You know, the stuff that, with alcohol, your 2-year-old drinks at $3 a gallon. I've brought this up before. We've got another video about the Judgment of Paris, which was a whole wine tasting debacle. I'll link to that below. Beyond the mystique, there is an entire industry selling vacations where people can go and make wine the traditional way, even though it's currently illegal in America to sell wine made in this way for obvious hygienic reasons. Indeed, it's been illegal for over a century. The whole thing is just good marketing for people who want to advertise these events and play up the fact that grape shredding is supposedly a common way of making wine, even though we've been pressing grapes in a vastly more efficient way for many, many millennia. Another factor that has played into the popularity of wine shredding is the now iconic 1956 episode of I Love Lucy, Lucy's Italian Adventure, which features the titular character stomping grapes in an Italian winery. The episode led to a surge in interest in the practice, despite the fact that the Californian grape farmers who supplied the grapes for the episode did so under the condition that a character would explicitly mention that grapes aren't really pressed by foot by winemakers. It should also be noted that, as alluded to, in rural Europe, where most of the imagery surrounding this practice is sourced from, the use of feet has been wholly absent from the professional winemaking process since the Middle Ages. And now for a bonus fact. During Prohibition, grape growers of the day began selling bricks of wine, which were primarily blocks of Rhine wine. These often included the following instructions. After dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug away from the cupboard for 20 days, because then it would turn into wine. And I wonder what message they were really trying to get across. Canadians boast longer lives, safer communities, free nationalized healthcare, a cleaner environment, the most gold medals in Olympic hockey, and of course, poutine. But contrary to popular belief, one thing they don't do any different than their friends to the south is make stronger beer. When you're dealing with mainstream beers, those with the highest alcohol are generally stouts, porters, and pale ales with alcohol by volume, that's ABV contents, typically ranging between 4 and 10%, though most mainstream beers tend to stay in the range of 4 to 6%. This includes Canada's popular Labatt at 5% ABV, edging out the United States' favorite brew Bud Light at 4.2%. For a few more comparisons using ABV, we have the US's Busch at 4.6, Coors Original 5%, Old Milwaukee 5%, Bud Ice 5.5, Keystone 4.4, Keystone Ice 5.9, and Budweiser at 5. On the Canadian side, we have Carling Black Label at 4.7, Grizzly Canadian Lager at 5.4, Moosehead at 5, Labatt Ice at 5.6, O'Keefe Canadian at 4.9, and Molson Canadian at 5. However, some Americans prefer their beer with a little extra kick, and United States brewers, they've certainly delivered. For instance, the kind people at Dogfish Head make the 120-minute IPA with an ABV of 20%, while the evil geniuses at Sam Adams have created Utopias, a brew that boasts a whopping 27% ABV. Of course, Canadian brewers are no slouches, and their breweries have produced some hefty beers as well, including Trafalgar's Critical Mass Double Imperial IPA with its 17% ABV, and the aptly named but apparently discontinued Corona
Eruptor at an ABV of 16%. As you can see from this, both nations boast brewers that make beers with a variety of alcohol levels, but there really is very little difference between the nations' respective brewers when you average them all out. This perhaps should not come as a surprise, as most people would like to be able to drink several beers while socializing or watching sports events without getting totally faced. As a result, the sweet spot for this type of recreational drinking tends to be in that 4 to 6% ABV range, which is favored by brewers the world over. So at this point, you might be wondering, well, where did the myth that Canadian beers contain significantly more alcohol than beers made in the US come from? And indeed, the US does have this reputation all around the world for making beers that are rather weak. This is despite the reality that the alcohol levels are pretty much similar in all nations. Well, it's generally thought that this comes from the fact that Canada, and most everywhere else, lists the alcohol levels in their beers by the aforementioned alcohol by volume, or ABV. As with many metrics, the United States initially decided to buck this trend and went with alcohol by weight, or ABW. This is the weight of the alcohol in a drink divided by the total weight. The key thing to note here is that alcohol is lighter than water, about 0.79 grams per cc at standard pressure and temperature versus 1 gram per cc of water. The result is that ABW in beers is typically going to equal 4/5 of the ABV. To illustrate, if you have a typical 12-ounce bottle of beer that is listed at 5% ABV, 5% of that 12 ounces in the bottle is going to be alcohol. On the other hand, take that same bottle but now list it as ABW, and because alcohol weighs about 4/5 of water by weight, it's only going to then be about 4% of the total weight of the beer in the bottle. It's the same amount of alcohol in the bottle, but if you don't pay attention to whether it's ABV or ABW, one looks less than the other. With most beers in the United States classically listing their beer by ABW instead of ABV, this ultimately led people to think that beer from the United States has about 20% less alcohol on average than their international counterparts. Today, of course, most brewers in the United States go with alcohol by volume, but the undeserved reputation for weaker beers has certainly endured. As we move past the summer and into the autumn, we can count on certain things: the leaves changing color, the weather growing crisper, ghost stories being told in certain parts of the world, and the celebration of the Bavarian tradition of Oktoberfest. Even as far away as America, Oktoberfest is beloved as a time for dancing, dressing in lederhosen, eating sausages, and of course, drinking beer. But what are the origins of Oktoberfest? What are we joyously celebrating, and do you actually have to wear very unflattering lederhosen? On October 12, 1810, the Bavarian Crown Prince Ludwig married Princess Theresa von Sachsen-Hildburghausen, a grand ceremony in the Bavarian city of Munich. In order to involve the commoners, the couple and their royal parents organized a giant wedding party for the entire city of Munich outside the city gates upon a piece of cattle grazing land. An estimated 40,000 Bavarians showed up ready to party and have fun, and they certainly did. Feasting, drinking, dancing were among the major highlights. Horse races, no doubt with huge wagers on the line, closed the festivities with the prince and his new bride cheering the ponies on. The party was so memorable that the meadow outside the city gates was renamed Theresienwiese, or Theresa's Fields, in honor of the blushing bride. Today, that meadow is known as Weissen, an abbreviation of the original name, and is still the site of the annual Munich Oktoberfest. A year later, the Bavarian royalty, fully aware that the celebration earns them tons of goodwill from their subjects, decided to do it again, this time with more horse races and an agricultural fair. And they celebrated again in 1812 and for the next 200 years, save for the 24 times that Oktoberfest has been cancelled due to wars and cholera epidemics. So, formally, Oktoberfest is a celebration of the wedding between Prince Ludwig and Princess Theresa, who would later become King Ludwig and Queen Theresa of Bavaria in 1825. However, Oktoberfest-like events, though not on this scale, had been going on without an official name for many, many years before that event. More than celebrating a marriage, Oktoberfest is a commemoration of the glorious process of beer making. The earliest known, purposefully concocted alcoholic beverage dates back about 9,000 years to China, with a treat made of rice, honey, and fermented fruit. The first barley beer can likely be traced to the Middle East and the Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia of 5,000 years ago. In 1992, archaeologists in the region uncovered ceramics with a beer-like residue on it that was estimated to be from 3,500 BCE. One of the earliest pieces of human writing is the Hymn of Ninkasi, not only an
ode to the Sumerian goddess of beer, but an actual recipe for ancient beer from 3,800 years ago. But in all likelihood, the recipe is even older than that. From there, the art of beer making traveled around the globe. It is well documented that the Egyptians and Romans enjoyed the beverage, with recipes and the types of beer varying with the region. In fact, beer was much more popular in places like England, Germany, and other European countries, where it was nearly impossible to grow grapes and have vineyards due to the colder weather, rendering the other popular alcoholic beverage of the time, wine, virtually a non-entity. By the Middle Ages, hops were being added as a preservative and for taste, bringing beer closer to what we know it as today. For years, people made and drank top-fermented beers, a process where fermentation occurs at a range of 62 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit or 16.6 to 25 degrees Celsius, causing the yeast to rise to the surface. This created ale, while adding hops made it a beer. It is speculated that bottom fermentation, or as it is known today, lagering, was discovered by accident in the 16th century when beer was stored in cool and dry caverns that were around 46 degrees Fahrenheit or 7.8 degrees Celsius for a long period of time. So what does any of this have to do with Oktoberfest? As you might have deduced from this, certain types of beer, or ales, or lagers if you want to get technical, can only be made under certain conditions, usually relating to temperature. Considering refrigeration is a relatively modern invention, this meant the kind of beer that could be made was typically reliant on the time of year and the weather. Ales, stouts, porters, and wheat beers are all part of the top-fermented beer family, and therefore were made when the temperatures were warmer. Lagers, pilsners, and bocks, as well as American malt liquor, are examples of bottom-fermented beers and were made in the cold winter months. Thus, as the summer turned into fall, Bavarian beer makers knew production was halting on their ales, stouts, etc., and beginning on the lagers, pilsners, and so forth. Considering German autumns get cold pretty quickly, late September, early October was a perfect time to drink the rest of the summer beer and try the first fresh batch of winter beer. In other words, the wedding of the prince and princess was just a perfectly timed excuse to get drunk with the abundance of beer available. So when you head out for Oktoberfest this year, remember that you are not only celebrating a wedding, but the perfect time to try all of the variations of beer and, of course, wear lederhosen. And now for some bonus facts. If it's called Oktoberfest and it celebrates a wedding that occurred on October the 12th, then why does it start in September? Well, that's due to the almighty tourism dollar. In the early 20th century, Germany realized that this festival was a major tourist attraction and lengthened the festival. It extends into September because the weather is better in Germany in September than it is in mid-October. And now for another bonus fact. October got its name from the Latin octo, meaning 8. If this seems odd to you, considering it's the 10th month in the modern calendar, Gregorian, well, that used to not be the case. It was once the 8th month in the Roman calendar, and the name simply carried over. And now for another bonus fact. Ever wonder why in America people say fall for the season, and much of the rest of the English-speaking world call it autumn? Well, the origin of fall as the name for a season is not perfectly clear, though it's thought that it probably came from the idea of leaves falling from trees and many plants, particularly the contraction of the English saying, fall of the leaf. It first popped up as a name for the season in the later 16th century in England and became particularly popular during the 17th century, at which point it made its way over to North America. Of course, calling autumn fall in England has since passed out of widespread practice, but it has survived as a common name for the season in North America. And now for another bonus fact. Well, you might now be wondering why we call the seasons summer, autumn, winter, and spring. Well, want to know more? Winter derives from the Proto-Germanic wentras, meaning winter. This, in turn, probably comes from the Proto-Indo-European PIE, wed, meaning wet. Alternatively, it may come from the PIE wind, meaning white. Either way, the Proto-Germanic wentras gave rise to the Old English winter as the fourth season of the year, and the name for the season has stuck around ever since. Spring, referring to the season rather than the many other meanings of the word, first popped up in the 16th century. Starting in the 14th century, this time of year was called springing time, and then in the 15th century, this got shortened to springtime, and then further shortened in the 16th century to just spring. The 14th century, springing time came about in reference to plants springing from the ground and things like that. Before the season was called these things, it was called Lent in Old English. Summer came from the Old English name for the season sumor, which in turn turn came from the Proto-Germanic summa, which itself came from the Proto-Indo-European root sam, meaning summer. Sam seems to be the variant of the Proto-Indo-European sem, meaning together or one. Autumn came to English from the Old French autumne, meaning autumn. This in turn came from the Latin autumnus, also meaning autumn. From here things get murky, but it's thought autumnus probably came from an Etruscan word and is possibly related to the Latin augear, meaning to increase. Beyond that, nobody is quite sure why the season was originally called that. Calling the season autumn in English first popped up in the 12th century, though was a rarity until around the 14th century. It then began to pick up steam and became common in the 16th century. About the same time, calling it fall popped up as a name for the season. Before calling the season autumn or fall in English, it was called harvest. Incidentally, you may also wonder why the seasons are called seasons. The word season in this context comes from the Old French saison, meaning sowing or planting. This in turn came from the Latin sationum, meaning sowing. Initially, this referred to actually sowing seeds, but later, as with the Old French saison, shifted definition to refer to the time period when you sow seeds, so literally seed time. Season in this sense in English popped up around the 13th century. It was also around this time that season popped up, referring to seasoning food, in this case from the Old French assaisonner, meaning to ripen. Plastic as a material has pretty much changed the way we live our lives. It's cheap, can be molded into practically any shape, and is, for the most part, easily recyclable when people bother to do so. So why is it that we still use glass bottles and cans to store our beer? Is it to do with aesthetics or taste, or maybe there's another factor at play? Now, many would be surprised to learn this, but it turns out that beer is sometimes stored in plastic bottles in some parts of the world. In the UK, plastic beer bottles are a fairly common sight at festivals and the like. In fact, at many festivals in the UK, it's actually mandatory to serve alcohol in plastic bottles. For example, during the 2012 Olympic Games, Heineken, the official alcohol sponsor of the Games, stocked fridges across London with over 1 million plastic bottles of beer made especially for the event. While they claimed it was for environmental reasons, it has been speculated that it was actually done due to safety concerns. For any event where you're going to have thousands of drunk people from various cultures watching a competition they're emotionally invested in or within extremely close proximity to one another, it just makes sense not to give them tiny glass clubs and the potential means of stabbing each other. So why isn't this practice more widespread, you ask? Well, perhaps the answer that's most pertinent to us as customers is that putting beer into plastic bottles can affect how it tastes. Plastic is a great deal more porous than glass, which itself is almost impermeable to oxygen and carbon dioxide. In lay terms, this means your beer or your soft drink will go flat sooner in a plastic bottle than it would in a glass one, because the carbon dioxide that makes it fizzy in the first place can more easily escape. The other benefit of glass is that it's almost completely taste neutral, which basically means that it doesn't chemically interact with whatever you store inside of it. To quote the totally unbiased Glass is Life, when you eat or drink something from glass, you're experiencing the pure taste of that food or drink, nothing more, nothing less. Plastic, on the other hand, is chock full of chemicals that could potentially leach into your drink and ruin your beer, and possibly more. For example, the plastic used to store soft drinks and indeed some beer, polyethylene terephthalate, often shortened to PET, leaches a toxic metalloid known as antimony, among other things, into your drink. When stored at room temperature or less, the amount of antimony that leaches is generally deemed safe, but as temperatures increase, so does the antimony levels in your drink. When stored in an uninsulated garage for a few months in the summer or other warm areas, the levels can exceed the recommended limits set by the Environmental Protection Agency. So in regards to aluminium cans, like glass, aluminium is relatively impermeable, making it an ideal storage container for beer. Interestingly, the inside of an aluminium can is coated with a special polymer specifically to reduce the risk of aluminium leaching into the beverage, which makes things far safer. Among other things, elevated aluminium levels in the body have been linked to diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And by the way, random bonus fact here, the man who Parkinson's disease is named after was actually implicated in a plot to assassinate King George III. In any event, aluminium cans also have the advantage of being entirely opaque, which protects the beverage it contains far better than other kinds of packaging. In fact, another reason glass, or more specifically colored glass, is often used to house
beer is because it helps protect the beer from the sun's rays. While it is possible to create plastic that is the same color, this has the potential to wreak havoc with the established plastic recycling initiatives that are already in place. The amber color of plastic beer bottles, combined with the additional layers needed to protect the beer inside, make them more difficult to recycle than the clear plastic bottles favored by the soft drink industry. A further issue with plastic bottles is that they simply can't stand up to the pasteurization process that most beers undergo. You see, after beer has been brewed and packaged, it will usually be passed through a machine that sprays it with boiling water to heat the liquid inside to kill off any microbes that could have survived the brewing process. This both ensures the beer is safe to drink and vastly improves its shelf life. While glass bottles and cans are more than capable of weathering this process without incident, plastic bottles tend to warp. This means you have to skip the process entirely or use a much more hard-wearing plastic, which increases its base cost, something companies are keen to avoid if possible. So, in the end, while there are indeed beer manufacturers out there who are looking for ways to make widespread use of plastic beer bottles a reality and convince the wider public to accept the switch, at this particular point in time, glass and aluminium cans are still king in this arena.
Although tequila dates back only a few hundred years, people have long used the heart of the agave plant to make delicious alcoholic beverages. Cultivated from at least as early as 200 AD by the Zapotecs of the Oaxaca Valley of southern Mexico, the maguey, also called agave in the century plant, has been an essential plant in the region for well over 1,000 years, providing the raw material for building homes and able to be converted into clothing and even rope. The numerous species of maguey were an invaluable source of fiber for those living in the arid rocky highlands. In addition, since agave stores juice in its heart, for well over 1,000 years people have used it as a food and liquid source, as well as transformed it into an alcoholic beverage. Yes, contrary to popular belief, Native Americans had many alcoholic drinks long before the Europeans arrived. In this case, liquid from the maguey's heart, sometimes called aguamiel, honey water, was traditionally collected from the head and fermented without heating, but simply through the introduction of natural yeasts. This resulted in a drink called pulque, with an alcoholic content of between 4 and 8%. It's still made today, and depending on the mixture, it can be sweet and fruity or a bit sour. Reputed to have been discovered by the goddess Mayahuel, pulque is also associated with another 400 rabbit deities. This large number of gods is thought to represent the infinite number of forms intoxication takes. When the Aztecs were conquered in the 16th century, the Spaniards also brought and shared the process of distillation, by which the fermented pulque was heated and the vapors captured, cooled, reconstituted, and collected, resulting in a stronger and purer alcoholic beverage known as mezcal. The name is said to derive from a Nahuatl term, metal or mezcametal, and unlike tequila, which can only be made from the blue agave plant, mezcal can use 11 different types of maguey found in Oaxaca. At first, mezcal was called a variety of names, including agave wine and mezcal brandy, before the simpler name of mezcal was settled upon. Now, this all brings us to tequila, which is protected due to Mexico's participation in the World Trade Organization, the Paris Convention for the Protection of Industrial Properties, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and other international treaties. This means the word tequila may only be applied to a particular type of mezcal made in a particular place. Under the control of the Tequila Regulatory Council, CRT, only the spirit made in the Jalisco state in west central Mexico, and only that distilled from the juice of the agave tequila Weber plant, blue agave, may officially be labeled tequila. The origin of the word, well, that's lost in time, but many believe it came from a Nahuatl term or phrase that alternately meant the place where they cut, the place of work, the place of wild herbs, and the place of tricks. Tequila is also the name of a town in the state of Jalisco that was officially established in 1666. Although there is some debate, most sources point to Don Pedro Sanchez de Tagle, the Marquis of Altamira, as the first person to mass-produce tequila, beginning in about 1600. However, it was not until 1795 that Don Jose Maria Guadalupe de Cuervo was the first to receive a license to make it from King Ferdinand IV of Spain. Don Zenobio Souza was the first to export tequila to the United States in 1873 when he shipped 3 barrels of it to El Paso, Texas. This was soon followed by a shipment from Don Cuervo as well. Tequila became much more popular in the US during World War II when importing whiskey from Europe became very difficult. In fact, the 6,000 gallons of tequila imported in 1940 had grown to 1.2 million gallons by 1945. Today, many credit Jimmy Buffett and his song Margaritaville, with ensuring tequila's place in the pantheon of America's most beloved spirits. Alright, so now let's have a quick chat about the worm. Well, contrary to popular belief, tequila should not have this in it. Officially, only mezcal is supposed to have the so-called worm, which itself is actually a caterpillar of the Comedia red-10-baccarii moth, which feeds on many varieties of the maguey plant. Its origin in mezcal is not clear, and some say that the tradition dates back to Aztec times when the priests would add the caterpillar to batches of pulque. Others believe the practice started later simply as a means to test the strength of distilled mezcal, watching to see how quickly the caterpillar died once placed in the bottle. However, given the lack of documented evidence of this practice until relatively modern times, it's also hypothesized that it was originally just a mid-20th century marketing stunt, rumored to have been thought up by Mexico City entrepreneur Jacobo Lorenzes Pais to help the sale of mezcal over its cousin tequila in the United States. The idea here was that the so-called worms were already frequently found in the brew to make mezcal anyway, so why not intentionally put them in the end product as a sort of talking point and a way to differentiate the drink. Connoisseurs also claim the caterpillar in the drink positively affects the taste. On that note, consumers who prize the worm often believe its color to be an indicator of quality. The red worm, which lives in the heart and root of the agave plant, is said to denote a higher quality mezcal when compared to the white or gold worm, which is stuck living out on the maguey's leaves. Have you ever wondered who invented eggnog and what it traditionally was made with? Well, want to know more. To begin with, yes, eggnog traditionally included raw eggs. However, some countries today, such as the United States, severely restrict the use of raw egg in products due to health concerns. Thus, most commercial eggnog does not include raw eggs. The FDA actually limits the egg yolk solids in eggnog to less than 1%. You can, however, buy pasteurized eggs first before making your own eggnog, or partially cook the raw egg in milk to make a custard, but eggnog connoisseurs tend to frown upon this as it supposedly alters the flavor and consistency of the final product. As to what else the traditional ingredients included, these are milk, cream, sugar, some sort of alcohol like rum, brandy, vodka, cognac, or whiskey, whipped eggs, and sometimes nutmeg, cinnamon, or other spices. While today, eggnog you buy in the store often excludes the alcoholic ingredient, traditionally this was always included and was half the point of eggnog. This brings us to where eggnog actually came from. I mean, who actually sat there and thought to themselves, you know what would be a good idea? Mixing raw excretions from a cow's udder and a chicken's cloaca with some sugar, alcohol, and spices. It isn't exactly known who was the first person to do this, but eggnog seems to have originated in Europe around the 17th century, very possibly in England. It was generally only drunk by the extremely wealthy due to the need for eggs and milk, which were a rarity for commoners in Europe at the time. Before eggnog, it was fairly common to mix milk with wine and other alcohol to make various forms of milk punches, including possibly the direct ancestor of eggnog, posset, which was a drink served hot that included milk and eggs mixed with wine or beer. Sometime around the 18th century, eggnog made its way to the Americas, where its popularity was much more widespread due to more people having direct access to cows and chickens, more commoners owned farms. As brandy, the alcoholic ingredient of choice in England, was somewhat expensive to get in the Americas from heavy taxing and lack of availability, the much cheaper and readily available rum became a popular substitute there. This later changed to whiskey and bourbon. George Washington himself had his own little recipe for eggnog, which included not just rum, but sherry and whiskey too. As to the name of eggnog, the origins are somewhat disputed, but obviously the first part comes from the egg ingredient. The origin of the second nog part is slightly murkier. It's possible that it derives from the Middle English word noggin, which originally referred to a small wooden mug and later any small container used to serve strong alcoholic beverages. Noggin may or may not be derived from nog, referring to certain types of beer brewed in East Anglia in the 17th century that had a high percentage of alcoholic content compared to most beers. A much less plausible theory often put put forward as to the origin of the name eggnog is that it comes from the Americas and was from egg and grog, referring to the rum ingredient in the Americas and this being morphed to eggnog. Whatever the case, the word eggnog started popping up around the very early 19th century on both sides of the pond, though the British still sometimes called it egg flip, referring to the process of mixing the ingredients.